Before dawn on April 26, 1865, assassin John Wilkes Booth had been cornered by the United States Army. Nearly 2 weeks prior, Booth had become the most wanted man in the country after he shot and killed President Abraham Lincoln. He'd been on the run ever since, and the 16th New York Cavalry Regiment was tasked with hunting him down and bringing him to justice. Booth was trapped inside a barn and refused to be taken alive. Meanwhile, Sergeant Boston Corbett eyed him from a crack in the wall. He witnessed Booth raising his weapon. Disobeying orders to take Booth alive, Corbett fired a single shot. Booth was paralyzed, and 3 agonizing hours later, he died. The public instantly hailed Corbett as a national hero, and he would go down in history as Lincoln's Avenger. Apart from this single act, Boston Corbett was not a notable figure of the Civil War. That is not to say, however, that he did not lead an interesting life. In fact, the killing of Booth was only one of many unique stories from his life, some which would mark him as a hero and others a madman. With the birth name Thomas, Corbett was born on January 29, 1832, in London. His family was continually moving until finally settling in the United States in Troy, New York, when he was 8 years old. A young man in his early 20s, Corbett married Susan Rebecca, a woman 13 years his senior. For a living, he made hats. It was a trade he'd learned as a teenager. Not even 2 years into the marriage, Susan died giving birth to a stillborn child. Emotionally devastated, he moved to Boston, Massachusetts, and tried to keep working, but he was unable to rebound. He became an alcoholic wandering the streets at night. His habits eventually cost him his job. He became homeless. One night, a street minister stopped a drunken Corbett and evangelized to him. That night, his life changed. He immediately quit drinking and joined the Methodist Episcopalian Church, where he attended regular prayer meetings. In fact, it wasn't long before Corbett began to do the ministering himself, wanting to share his miraculous transformation. Among the church members, Corbett earned a reputation for being eccentric. He was exceptionally loud and flamboyant during praise and worship, and even during sermons. A frequent phrase he shouted, "Glory to God, come to Christ," earned him the nickname, the Glory to God Man. To mimic the appearance of Jesus Christ, he grew out a beard and exceptionally long hair. He'd change his name to Boston Corbett, in honor of the city of his rebirth. His boldness wasn't limited to the walls of the church. No longer an alcoholic, he returned to work as a hatter, where he regularly proselytized to co-workers and sang hymns aloud. A swear word or mention of alcohol from his co-workers would send him to his knees to pray for them. This made keeping a job difficult, but sometimes Corbett would leave of his own volition. He wouldn't work for immoral employers. One employer was fixing up used hats and selling them as new. Learning of this, Corbett promptly quit. When he wasn't at work, he'd seek out people to evangelize to. Walking the streets of Boston were many poor and destitute alcoholics who Corbett reached out to, encouraging them to drop their drinking habits, converting them to Christianity, and providing for their needs until they could find work. All of this while Corbett himself struggled to keep a job, but as one of his peers wrote, quote, "No amount of talk would change his ways." This often left him begging from his fellow congregation members, who didn't mind helping. Corbett was always quick to pay his debts. The peak of his extreme behavior up to this point, however, would come on July 16, 1858. Walking home from a religious meeting, he was confronted by 2 prostitutes who propositioned him for sex. He declined, but was disturbed by his urges. At home, he read from the book of Matthew, quote, "And if thy hand or foot causeth thee to stumble, cut it off, and cast it from thee. And if thy right eye offend thee, pluck it out, and cast it from thee. And there be eunuchs which have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake." On his own, without medical assistance, Corbett took a pair of scissors and chopped off his own testicles. He then ate a meal and attended another prayer meeting. In fact, he only received medical attention after someone else, learning of the injury, called for a doctor. Medical professionals were stunned, unable to imagine the pain he must have put himself through. He was simply eager to recover. The idea of preaching without the torment of temptation thrilled him. People of the Methodist Episcopal Church had a long history of being over the top, but even they found Corbett to be extreme. His conversion had certainly been dramatic and emotional, but something more was likely causing his behavior. As the phrase, "mad as a hatter," would suggest, the profession of making hats has been connected to mental illness. This is attributed to a regular exposure to mercury fumes. Symptoms of erethism, or Mad Hatter disease, include paranoia, delusions, hallucinations, and psychosis. Not only had Corbett worked as a hatter since his youth, but it's a profession he would regularly return to. As such, his eccentric behaviors would only increase throughout his life. The American Civil War broke out in April of 1861, and 29-year-old Boston Corbett was quick to enlist in the Union Army. His peculiarities were readily apparent. Corporal Edward Kirk, who served alongside Corbett, wrote, quote, "Almost daily something would occur which would mark him as different from others. For Corbett, even the hardships of war were no excuse to drink alcohol or to stop observing the Sabbath, and he insisted his fellow troops follow the same morals. Curse words were also off limits. He even reprimanded a superior for using the word damned. This earned him 2 days in a jail cell, but it didn't seem to bother him. Upon his release, he walked out smiling, saying he had a, quote, good time with his God and his Bible, and he gave no apology. Such defiance eventually led to a court-martial and discharge, though he would simply re-enlist later that same month. Still, Corbett showed many positive attributes. Corporal Kirk noted, quote, "He was a very religious man, faithful at his post of duty, a good speaker, and a skillful and helpful nurse to those who were ill or in distress, and he knew no fear. This fearlessness showed in battle. When others retreated, Corbett stood and fought, proclaiming glory to God with each Confederate he shot." A particular heroic moment occurred in 1864. During his second enlistment, he was captured as a POW. A fellow prisoner wrote about an incident while him and Corbett were among the 2,000 prisoners in transit to Andersonville Prison. Quote, "There was a small stream of water close to the guard line, and the prisoners made a rush for it. Most of them had no water for many hours, but the guards kept them back. One of the more venturesome than the rest got through the line and attempted to fill his canteen. He was immediately shot in the arm with buckshot by one of the guards. He was pushed back among our men and laid under a tree. The wounded man was suffering greatly and called for water to ease his pain, but none had any in his canteen. Boston Corbett stepped out of the ranks, having been unable to stand silent any longer. He crossed the deadline, filled his canteen in the stream, and gave the wounded man a drink. The guards continually threatened him with death, but Corbett ignored them and went about his business. Despite their threats, he returned unharmed and rejoined the ranks of prisoners. The cheers of the soldiers at this brave deed could have been heard 1 mile away, but Corbett seemed to think it was not out of the ordinary. "It was the bravest deed I had seen during the war." Of course, his most notable act would come at the war's end. On April 14, 1865, 5 days after the surrender of General Lee, President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated by famous actor and Southern sympathizer John Wilkes Booth. Corbett's regiment was tasked with hunting down Booth. Booth's final stand was in a barn, which he refused to leave, saying he wouldn't be taken alive. While the other soldiers lit the barn on fire, attempting to force him out, Corbett eyed him through a crack in the wall. Acting on his own, he fired a fatal shot, which killed Booth. An immediate court-martial and arrest followed. Corbett fully acknowledged that he defied orders, but said it was done in self-defense, as he saw Booth raising his weapon. He also claimed that he shot to wound, not to kill, but that a sudden movement from Booth resulted in the bullet being lodged in his head. Stories from witnesses contradict Corbett's claim. 2 men said they never saw Booth raise his weapon, nor any sign that Corbett was in danger. The matter would never be investigated, however. After questioning Corbett, Secretary Edwin Stanton simply said, quote, "The rebel is dead. The patriot lives. He has spared his country expense, continued excitement, and trouble." Another potential reason for the leniency was that Corbett was now a national hero. After his release, he was greeted by a cheering crowd asking him for autographs. Photographer Matthew Brady ushered Corbett into his studio to take a portrait of the man now known as Lincoln's Avenger. Corbett, however, gave glory to God for avenging Lincoln. Furthermore, he refused offers to sell the pistol which he had used to shoot Booth. One of Booth's pistols was even offered to him, but not wanting a permanent reminder of the killing, he declined this as well. He received part of the reward for hunting Booth, and for his service, he received an annual salary. Following the war, he returned to his old habits, ministering and hat-making. Despite his hero status, keeping a job was still a challenge, as none of his fame had diminished his eccentric behavior. Job prospects became so scarce that by 1870, he'd tried to capitalize on his title as Lincoln's Avenger. At Sunday schools, women's groups, and tent meetings, he'd recount the killing of Booth. But he would ramble incoherently, and was therefore never reinvited. He was also described as, quote, speaking so rapidly that you could hardly follow him at all. This marks a contrast with Corporal Kirk's description of Corbett as a good speaker from a decade prior. This was possibly a sign of his declining mental health. Part of this decline was intense paranoia. Previously, he'd been unusually suspicious of certain people, but now fear was beginning to run his life. He was convinced that people in the government were bitter towards him because of the Booth killing. The government was deprived of the chance to try, execute, and make an example of the assassin. In fact, there were many who did openly resent Corbett, but he believed they were out to ruin his life. His inability to keep work wasn't, in his mind, a result of his behavior, but part of a conspiracy. But this wasn't his only conspiracy theory. He also believed men were out to kill him as vengeance for John Wilkes Booth. At all times, he kept a weapon with him. At the slightest of suspicions, he'd draw it on strangers or friends. Under his pillow, he kept a revolver and would frequently wake in the middle of the night to draw it. Even as he preached from the pulpit, there was a pistol at his side. Had anyone simply questioned his integrity, Corbett would whip out his gun. Rarely would he fire. The threats were enough to clear a room full of people. Once he even chased a group of men out of a building. In 1878, Corbett lived as a homesteader in Kansas. Though he was active in the church, he would become disliked by the community. In 1885, at age 52, he fired upon a group of boys who ran across his property. Later in court, one boy's father accused Corbett of being a liar. At this accusation, Corbett brandished his gun, announcing that he'd fallen among thieves. After sending everyone running from the courtroom, Corbett simply got on his horse and returned home. When officers came to arrest him, he stood at the door, rifle in hand, refusing to be arrested again. Charges against him were dropped. Those who managed to stay on Corbett's good side, such as friends from the war, still described him as a good man, but said that he was tormented by terror and paranoia. Despite efforts to help him, Corbett's eccentric behavior, and now also his deadly paranoia, would ruin every opportunity. They would also finally get him arrested in 1887, only after a group of police cornered him and pinned him to the ground. He was sentenced to the Topeka Asylum for the insane, but this wouldn't last long. Just a year later, he escaped on horseback. After this, official records on Corbett become scarce. Search parties weren't able to locate him. It was later learned that after the escape, he briefly stayed with an old friend from the war. He said that he was leaving for Mexico. After boarding a train in 1888, Boston Corbett, age 56, became a mystery. The whereabouts of Lincoln's Avenger became a matter of national intrigue. Over the following decades, men would occasionally claim to be Corbett, but all of them were found to be imposters. Likely, they were trying to claim his war pension. Some people believe that Corbett may have died in the Great Hinckley Fire. In September of 1894, a massive forest fire in Minnesota killed over 400 people. The list of dead and missing contained the name Thomas Corbett. This would have placed him nowhere near his claimed hiding place of Mexico. Furthermore, the surname Corbett was not uncommon. so it's possible it was simply another Thomas Corbett. But it's also possible that for some reason, Boston Corbett changed his route and was using his birth name Thomas as an alias. Nevertheless, his fate remains impossible to know. While some consider Boston Corbett to be nothing more than a madman, he is widely remembered as Lincoln's Avenger and as a national hero.